Right. Welcome to the meeting of the Planning Policy Committee. Right. Welcome to the meeting of the Planning Policy Committee. Members, when I invite you to speak, please ensure you have one of the microphones in front of you before speaking, as microphones are needed for the hearing loop and for the audio recording. These are all switched on, ready for you to speak, so you do not need to adjust them. Please make sure that the microphone is directly in front of you before speaking. Members, voting will be done on a show of hands in line with the Constitution. I will ask for a show of hands for and then against recommendations. Those abstaining from voting will be noted by officers. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence. None have been received. Agenda item 2, non-members attending. We have Councillor Ian Ward, Councillor Andrew Cross, Councillor Simon Wootton, Councillor Sperring, and Councillor Stanley, and Councillor Angelina Marriott. Sorry, I couldn't see you. Councillor Cripps, thank you. And Councillor Waite. Thank you. Agenda item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 23rd of June 2021. Members, are the minutes agreed? Is that yes? Okay, I was there as well and I'd agree them. Thank you. Agenda item 4, to receive declarations of interest. Members, are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Steptoe. Councillor Newport. Okay. Councillor Lumley.
As a member of Essex County Council.
Thank you.
Yes, Chairman, Essex County Council, the monitoring officers advised me.
Chairman, that is in response to item 8 of the
High risk assessment. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. In that case, Chairman, on that advice, I declare an interest as an Essex County Councillor.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman, to confirm, Councillor Steptoe, Councillor Lumley, Councillor Hoy and Councillor Newport has declared an interest to item 8.
Thank you. Right, agenda item number 5, local plan evidence base open space study 2022. Members, Daniel Kudler will present the officer's report.
Okay, you can hear me? Excellent. Hi, good evening, everyone. Those who haven't met me before, my name is Dan Kudler. I'm a senior strategic planner on the planning policy team. So the open space study is an important part of evidence base for the new local plan. It helps identify areas in the district where there may be a deficiency in provision of either open space in general or specific categories of open space, such as play areas or natural green space, etc. The study is an update of the earlier 2009 study, and it provides a comprehensive audit and analysis of the district's open space provision in terms of quantity, quality and accessibility using nationally recognised benchmark standards for these. GIS mapping software was used to assess quantity and accessibility using standards that assess the amount of open space per 1,000 population for quantity, and for accessibility the study looked at walking distance of open spaces from communities, allowing for the identification of areas which are poorly catered for using the national benchmarks for accessibility. For example, where for a children's play space, the benchmark would be 600 metres or a 12 to 13 minute walk, or for a natural green space, that would be at 920 metres or a 20-minute walk. For the quality assessments in the study, these are based on 165 site visits to the vast majority of the district's open spaces undertaken by the team using the green flag criteria relating to accessibility, security, cleanliness, maintenance, and facilities and amenities. This information can be used in the new local plan to ensure any potential development sites in these communities contribute to new provision. In terms of the findings, beginning with quantity, the study identified 707 hectares of open space, which equates to just over 8 hectares per 1,000 people in the district. 43% of this was recreation or outdoor sports facilities, for example, football or cricket, whilst a further 36% was natural and semi-natural open space. In terms of geographical distribution, there is an uneven picture, as shown in map 1 on the committee paper. The majority of open space is concentrated in the western half of the district, where on one hand you have high concentration of population, and on the other hand you have the Upper Roach Valley and places like Hockley Woods and Cherry Orchard Country Park. Eastern half is more sparsely populated, contains more open farmland along with the MOD land. In terms of wards, Roach South contained the most open space, whilst Hawkwell East had the least, having no space within its tightly drawn boundaries, although a number of sites just outside. In terms of the recommended benchmark standards for different types of open space per 1,000 people, the district's performance varies. So it exceeds standards in provision for things such as recreation and outdoor sports, 3.48 hectares per 1,000 against a benchmark nationally of 1.6, and things like natural and semi-natural green space, 2.92 per 1,000 compared to a benchmark of 1.8. However, provision falls short of the standard for things such as amenity green space, 0.29 compared to 0.6, play spaces, 0.06 compared to 0.25, and allotments, 0.13 compared to differing national standards of either 0.21 or 0.3. The district's population is set to increase by 12.5% to 2040. This would mean less open space per 1,000 residents if no further space is provided. So currently it's just over 8 hectares per 1,000 people. By 2040, this would be 7.19 hectares per 1,000 people if nothing was done to increase provision. So a further 88.3 hectares of open space would need to be provided in order to give a similar level of provision. New development housing has traditionally been a key enabler of new open space, with around 85 hectares delivered in this way since 2009 through sort of housing schemes, and a further 76 hectares currently in the pipeline. So those are things which are, due to be built out at some point. In terms of the quality assessment, 45% of the sites audited were rated excellent or very good, although 29% were assessed to be fair or poor. The better scoring sites had a good range of facilities, were in generally good condition, were accessible, well signed, and felt safe. I'd refer you to Table 3 in the committee paper for more details, along with Appendix C of the accompanying report, which is a lengthy but very comprehensive set of accounts of the site visits for each of those 165 sites. So those will be eventually put on the website for deep diving. In terms of accessibility, the analysis showed the majority of populated areas are within walking distance of an open space, with virtually all urban areas and the majority of villages catered for. However, there are some notable exceptions. For example, South East Holbridge and areas of Rochford close to Southend Road and Ashington Road. In these areas, actually, within a reasonable walking distance, someone wouldn't encounter an open space. In terms of rural communities, there is also an issue as well. Places such as South Fambridge, outlying areas of Canewdon and Pagglesham, again, no designated open spaces within walking distance. And when you consider whether a community has access to open spaces which are publicly accessible, so not private sports facilities and things like that, or considering, places which have access walking distance to more than one open space, the gaps become more notable. Detailed settlement by settlement analysis is available in the report. So the report sets out ways to tackle deficiencies in provision, which should be considered alongside the local plan as it is progressed, ensuring that any site allocations and site-specific policies help plug the gaps in access to open space for both existing and new communities. So this could include designating new areas of open space, repurposing existing open space for alternative uses and providing the provision elsewhere in a more appropriate place to ensure there's no net loss, or using existing spaces and adapting them to provide a greater diversity of amenities. So that's the overview, and happy to take any questions or come back to you in more detail offline if that's more useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Members, do we have any questions? Councillor Steptoe.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a query. You commented there that Roche South is got the largest amount, which I'm very pleased to say because it's my ward. Is that partly because of Cherry Orchard?
Yes, that is almost entirely Cherry Orchard.
Okay. And the other question was that I'm not sure if I've missed it in the paper, but do you include open spaces that are owned by parishes? I'm thinking of, for example, Barling Wildlife Park.
Yes. So Barling Wildlife Park is included in there. What is not necessarily included are things like open agricultural land that might have public rights of way running through it, where obviously people can walk along the footpaths and enjoy the openness, but it's not necessarily an accessible open space. And similarly, certain local wildlife sites or things such as Wallasey Island, where again the public has access, but it's the point of it is to be a wildlife reserve and a special scientific interest rather than a public open space. So it's so it's fair to say that the full picture of provision within the district, you need to consider that network of rights of way alongside the 707 hectares. So you do have a little bit of additional.
Okay, Chairman, if I can come back. You mentioned Wallasey Island there. I wasn't clear. Is Wallasey Island included or not?
It's not, no.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Members, any other questions? Councillor Hoy.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a few points which are questions as well, because I have concerns about the report and what it misses out and where it leaves us with the recommendation, which is printed twice in here, but the one I'm looking at is on page 5.18, which I think is quite loose. I think we've been called out before in the past with our local plan where we leave things to further stages in the process rather than trying to nail them down early. And it's recommended that any future spatial strategy, site selection and an allocation process for the new local plans considers the findings presented in this study to consider how new developments might help address any existing deficits. It doesn't really, there's no bite there, is there? It's quite loose, and I'd like to understand that, but before, and on that basis, I'm toying with the idea of asking for it to be reconsidered and put back to the committee to reconsider a few other points I'm trying to make now as well. One of which is about the equality and diversity implications. I think we've got into quite a lot about accessibility of the sites, but there's nothing about accessibility for the less abled at all. And I'm aware, I think we're doing something in Hockley Woods at the moment to address this issue, but I think this report should have mentioned that. It's a big thing at the moment. There's no mention of toilet facilities. I know Holbridge Recreation Ground is lucky it's got a toilet facility. There's a public toilet by the river. I'm not sure about other areas, but perhaps we should be considering this. If we're trying to get more land, I know Holbridge has been quite lucky in getting, I think it was 6.2 hectares with the new development. Perhaps we should be thinking about toilet facilities, because there are some people who cannot get out because they need to be able to know there's a toilet near where they're going. And I think that should have been considered in the report, along with the ability of those less able-bodied people to use these spaces. I got concerned about some of the privately owned sites, which you've said are publicly accessible, but Holbridge Sports and Social Club is not publicly accessible. They have gates on it. You can go and watch football there. If you pay, you can go and play football there. So I'm not sure if we're excluding Farmers Fields while we're including Holbridge Sports and Social Club. I'm aware it's a sports ground, but it's not publicly accessible. And I think the same is probably for the rugby club, tennis club as well, probably. King George's playing field, obviously, that's publicly accessible, but I've got concerns around how that works as well. I think there's the contradiction I found, which I think you've slightly mentioned, is that Holbridge comes up with really good open space figures, but then it says it's not very accessible because it's quite a long walk for some people there. I'm not sure if that contradicts or if that's accurate. I don't know on that one. And one of the other points is with the big thing about what I read out as the recommendation is about how new developments might help address any existing deficits. Now, we're talking about quantity and we're talking about quality. Obviously, new developments tend to be the public open space, and this has been a bugbear, I know, of Councillor Sperry when he used to chair this committee, are usually funded within this council by a private management company which is paid for solely by the residents of that new estate. So in Holbridge, for instance, High Elms, the houses on High Elms, which is the new estate of Barrett David Wilson Homes, will be paying for the maintenance of the open space on that area, including the play areas, and I, who do not live on there, will go and use it. So I think this is an area. I think it's the Bird Estate in Rayleigh. I'm looking to Councillor Newport for confirmation, which Councillor Sperry always used to mention, which has felt no one knows who owns it anymore, and it will probably fall back to the council to be maintained at some point. So I think that is an omission in the report. We're not really talking about that, and I think if we're going to send it, if we're saying it needs to be addressed by new developments, we need to address how this is going to work and if our current model is an acceptable way of working.
Okay, Councillor Hoy, thank you. I'll take some advice, actually, if I may. We asked for questions and there weren't any. We're being asked to note the report.
Yeah,
Can
well,
I check?
I'd have to done a
Hang on a
proposal,
second.
Chairman, to send the
Hang on,
report
I'm
back.
just asking for
waiting
some
a second.
advice. Could I ask, is it appropriate to note the report and make additional recommendations to be fed back into the process?
I think, Chairman, Mr Kudler here can answer, clarify some of the questions that Councillor Hoy has. So if we can just hear from the officer
Okay,
first.
I took them mainly as observations rather
No,
than
they were questions.
Okay.
Quite clearly.
No, thank you, Councillor Hoy, and you know, I appreciate the points you're making, and I think you know they are valid ones, to be honest. So this is a piece of evidence base for the new local plan. So you know we can make recommendations, broad recommendations for things like new development should help plug the gaps in provision and accessibility, and that's something that a local plan evidence base would typically do. So if it was found that there was a glaring great big hole in a certain community and there were certain promoted sites coming forward there which perhaps had potential for delivering housing, then absolutely part of that future site specific policy linked to that allocation perhaps should involve some sort of contribution towards open space. I appreciate that we are at this stage being fairly woolly in terms of that, because we are waiting for additional pieces of evidence for the local plan, things like infrastructure delivery plan. Absolutely take your point regarding accessibility, and talking about I mean, obviously accessibility is referred to extensively in the report, but that's more about generally how someone might walk or drive to a site. But you're absolutely right that we need to consider how disabled people might access a site, and in that respect probably the majority of open spaces would perhaps not necessarily be up to scratch. We can certainly look at adding some caveats to reflect that, and aspirations perhaps for doing better. The point around privately owned sites is a valid one. Within the reports, within the appendix to the reports, which isn't there today, we do talk where we have identified a private site management company. But you're correct that the report does not necessarily go into details about the delivery mechanism and the fact that a large amount of future provision coming through development would be brought forward in that way and maintained in that way. And yes, you're right. I mean, I think the issue with Holbridge is that there is fairly good, and it's done on a ward by ward basis. So there is fairly good overall provision. You obviously reference things like the Sports and Social Club, which is a private site. We inherited a methodology from the 2009 study and the data sets which looked at football sites as a whole, rugby sites as a whole, cricket sites, for example, and I do appreciate that it doesn't within that delineate between public and private, and there are caveats within the document that talk about this. So yeah. I'm very happy to come back with a fuller answer, privately if that's useful.
Mr. Goodman's asked to
Yeah,
add
that's
to that.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the thing that I was just going to add around the identification of sites really was that in the allocations plan, we already have quite a large number of protected open spaces. So the starting point really for assessing sites has been those protected open spaces. So that includes public and private sites, because although they don't have a public right of access always, those private sports sites, for example, are still worth safeguarding. And so, from an allocations perspective, they're still protected, because if a planning application came in, we'd want to see them, their loss offset, or we'd want to see their loss avoided. And so in that sense, they make up a part of the overall provision. I think, what we'd accept is that there is a difference between a site that's got full public access and no public access. And there are sites that are somewhere in the middle. But in terms of the sites that have been assessed and the underlying data, then certainly we have a good idea for every site, whether it's in public ownership, private ownership. And so in that sense, we have the underlying data to be able to say, well, this is what it looks like just including public sites, this is what it looks like just including private sites. It does get slightly messy, because what you'll find inevitably is that you have private sites that aren't available for sports, but they might have public rights of way going through the middle of them, and there's perhaps a sense that they are public, although they're not. So on that specific issue, I think the private sites are in there for a very important reason, in that they make up part of that provision, although, I think we accept that there is a distinction between public and private sites. I think just in terms of the purpose of the study as well, I think what I would say is that the purpose of the study at this stage is clearly just evidence to inform a future decision. And so in that sense, there's no, it's not policy, there's no sense at the moment that, if we were to look at the findings now, that they necessarily bind the committee into looking at anything in a certain way in the future. And so in that sense, there's, there may be a need, obviously, to prepare an addendum or something to this kind of study in the future to pick up on those kinds of issues as well. So it is just evidence. And I think, just to clarify, and I think I'm right in saying this, but the recommendation is set out at 10.1. What's unfortunately kind of worded at 3.36 is a more passive recommendation, in the sense of what we are suggesting the study would be used for, but that's not actually the recommendation that we're putting forward to the committee. So I hope that clarifies. If there's any question that hasn't been answered, I'm more than happy to come back.
Yeah, if I may come back, Chairman. A question, and then perhaps to build on what Daniel Goodman said. The question is so for places such as Holby Sports and Social Club, the tennis club, and the other one which I'm on the wrong page for, how these are privately owned clubs which have scored highly in quality, how much have they skewed the quality assessment? If they were removed, would the quality go down significantly? Because I noticed they were around 90-odd%, whereas the average was 72, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's always the issue when you aggregate things in tables, is that they start to obviously average things out. I mean, what I would say is that the underlying data obviously allows for all of the site assessment, quality assessment for every site to be unpicked, and so we can package up summary tables in many different ways, in the sense by omitting X and omitting Y. I'd say it probably depends. For example, if you've got a ward with lots of private sports clubs, then that's going to be skewed more. That you might find there are wards with next to no private sports clubs, so they're not skewed as much. There will be an element of skewing if you were to look at it in a public versus private sense, and just because there's obviously quite a lot of private sports clubs in there, there are also obviously lots of public recreation grounds.
Okay. If I just may come back then around what Daniel Goodman said. My concern is that this is an evidence document, so what's in it will be used as evidence to effectively eventually go into the local plan, which would then be policy. Daniel Goodman mentioned about an addendum. Is it possible to add an addendum raising my concerns on the issues I've raised, which seems to be, and Daniel Kudler seemed to be in reasonable agreement with most of them, as to being a good point?
Yeah, everything.
So they're not forgotten?
Yeah, I mean, everything that you've suggested around the accessibility in a slightly different sense to how we've used that word,
Yes.
and picking those things up, I think I'm fairly confident we can add as an addendum. So, I mean, subject to obviously any other questions or observations that might be made by the committee, I think we would be fairly comfortable to commit to doing a follow-up addendum that addresses some of those issues. I mean, in a sense, probably neither of us are qualified to do a very robust accessibility assessment in terms of equalities, etc. But what we can certainly look to do is do something that addresses that thing in-house. And if we need to, if there's a compelling case to, then obviously consider doing that in a more specialist sense. So we can have a look at those options.
I think there's a compelling case to do so, but we can. I'm not sure whether that can be done in the addendum or there's still a chance to pick that up further along the line. I don't know. So.
Indeed, I think I would describe that as a work in progress, that part, and that will be picked up. Is that fair?
So I look
Councillor
forward to the
Newport.
addendum.
Councillor Newport.
Thank you, Chairman. It's not going to come as any surprise to Daniel or Dan that how disappointed I was with the quality of the report. In the appendix, I think you'll find that the page numbers don't match up. The maps are poor quality and the table layout's dreadful. On page 5.10, item 3.21, local green space assessment, I think you were discussing both public and private play space. Can you tell me why that Raleigh Town Sports and Social Club has been omitted from that list? Because I can't see it in there.
In terms of a local green space recommendation, do you mean?
Yeah.
I will have to. I mean, I'll have to go back to our spreadsheet, which looks, at the methodology against a set, a range of sort of national criteria. So yeah, happy to pick that up and come back to you on that.
Chairman, given the quality of the report, I'd like to recommend that this report goes back to planning policy for further work. And hopefully I've got a second there on that.
I'll second that.
Can I just take advice on that, please, Angela? Is that appropriate?
So, Chairman, there's a motion on the floor for the report to go back to planning policy to be reconsidered. However, this report is merely for noting, and the officers have taken the observations and the concerns of Councillor Hoy and Councillor Newport into consideration. The motion is on floor. It's been seconded by Councillor Hoy, and members will have to take a vote on that.
Okay. Councillor Steptoe was asking to speak before that motion was placed.
Thank you, Chairman. I was picking up on the point of the new estates where they have these open spaces. I have had communication from a number of residents on one particular estate where they're having to pay something like £300 a year towards maintenance, and they're questioning whether those open spaces are public open spaces. Now, is it conceivable that they could be closed off as they're managed by a private company and are linked to that particular estate? Secondly, with regards to sports fields, the development that is currently going on at Sutton with the Southend United training ground, that is now well underway, and that is quite a substantial side. Should that also be included?
Thank you, Councillor Steptoe. Just picking up on the Southend United point first, I would suggest probably not, because it's for formal, professional or semi-professional standard sports facilities. That's not to say it's not important, but I think there probably is a distinction in the methodology around the types of facilities that might be available at a kind of lower level and those facilities. once they are established, I think we can consider the case to protect them. But at the moment, I think we would struggle probably to do a quality assessment of them because they don't yet exist, and we'd probably struggle to do an accessibility assessment of them likewise. So, I mean, I think we'd be more than happy to consider the case to do that. There's probably a distinction in my mind, and I'm happy to kind of have my mind kind of challenged, but between that kind of facility and the type that's looked at in the report, but clearly we can take a look at that. Could you kindly remind me of your first question? Sorry,
With regards to new estates,
sure.
where they're paying quite substantial management fees, £300 odd a year in one particular case, and residents are saying, well, hang on a second, we're paying for this, why is it's not necessarily publicly open?
Yes, and I think that's a fair point. I think from the purpose of the report, what we've looked at is open spaces that require protecting through the plan, and I would include in that the types of open space that are built on new developments that are privately managed, because by being safeguarded through the local plan as open space, clearly that's another way of protecting against their loss for their value for the community. Clearly, some management companies will attempt to prevent public access to those sites, others less so. So it is a slightly hard picture. In terms of the actual long-term safeguarding of that land, I mean, in the planning process, the loss of that land is highly likely to be resisted because it will be protected for in the planning consent, etc. I think what's a slightly different issue, and one that's probably not possible to pick up in the report, is around the fate of management companies after a long period of time, and I think that's something we've touched upon today. So management companies that exist for an amount of time and then disappear, and people aren't clear what then the fate of that land is. That's a challenge, but not one that can easily be picked up in this kind of planning assessment. I'd say it's probably a management issue, but those privately managed open spaces are still worthy of being included in the report because clearly they make up part of that provision. It's just important, I think, as we picked up in other conversations, that they're clearly delineated as privately managed as opposed to public. And if we need to do some analysis around public open space compared to private open space, then I think we can do that to avoid it skewing the picture when it comes to looking at provision. If that answers your question.
Thank you. Just to comment on South United, yes, I do accept the fact that it is a big hole at the moment with a great big bulldozer sitting in the middle of it, so I do accept it's not quite there yet.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think just to summarise, I think what I'd say on that point is if there is a case to consider it in a future assessment, I think we can do that. But its status at the moment does feel like slightly different to the rest of the sites in the report.
Thank you.
Could remind us of the wording of the motion, please, Angela.
Chairman, I think you'd have to turn to Councillor Newport.
Thank you. Yes. Sorry. Councillor Newport.
Chairman, I would like to recommend to the committee that this report is sent back to planning policy for further work, and since Councillor Steptoe, I take it, was speaking to that motion, I'll just add his little bit in there that there's obviously a lot of issues that are unresolved that need to be looked at before this report comes forward to planning policy again, please. Would you second that?
Yes, I'll second it.
Could I propose an amendment to include the wording to address the issues that have been raised this evening?
Yeah.
Have a second?
Yeah.
Happy.
Yeah. Okay.
Agree with that as well.
Okay. Vote on the amendment. All in favour? Thank you. Unanimous. Vote on the motion. All in favour? Unanimous. Thank you.
So, Chairman, were you doing abstentions and, or was that unanimous? I didn't see.
Everyone voted.
I couldn't see everyone's hand.
Members, agenda item 6, spatial options, regulation 18, consultation, feedback report. Members, Daniel Kudler will present the officer's report.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to pick out a few of the key headline findings from the report, although I would stress that the report itself contains a far more in-depth analysis of a wide range of issues, and the Appendix 3 within that report summarises the responses received on a question-by-question and settlement-by-settlement basis. All individual responses can also be viewed on the online platform. The consultation took place last year between 28th of July and 21st of September. It was accompanied by a range of publicity, including physical mail-out, series of pop-up events, email newsletter, webinar, and a range of social media notices. In total, over 1,500 unique responses were received to the consultation, representing the views of 1,814 respondents. This is where we were notified by the respondent that, they were representing a household of 2 or 4 or so on. We received almost 7,000 unique responses to the various questions set out in the document, giving us a large body of data to go through. The vast majority of responses were from individuals, i.e. residents and businesses in the district. Although alongside that, we had responses from the development community, from neighbouring local authorities and other statutory consultees, for example, Anglian Water, Essex County Council, people like that. One of the main questions the consultation sought to ask was for feedback on the spatial strategy options proposed, i.e. broadly, what pattern should development take, how should it be concentrated, and where should it be located? This particular question received 358 responses representing 419 individuals. The open-ended nature of the question meant many consultees gave more than one preference for an option, so we have sought to include this range of opinion in the committee report. If I could refer you to Table 2, you'll see the full range of preferences expressed, which includes second preferences. Alongside this, Table 3 seeks to merge these into more simplified preferences. As a quick reminder, Option 1 is to prioritise development on brownfield and urban sites. Option 2 is a strategy pursuing urban extensions. Option 3 is an approach concentrating growth somewhere in the district, well, in 3 different potential locations, whilst Option 4 is an approach combining a number of the above. On balance, when considering the options presented, the preference was for a concentrated growth option, i.e. Option 3, although opinion on that was closely split between 3A, west of Rayleigh, and 3B, north of Southend. It is important to note that a large number of responses, around 39%, were for other options not presented within the consultation. This includes all views which didn't fit neatly into one of the spatial strategy options presented. So examples within that include respondents who were against any form of development whatsoever, those who were in favour of an infrastructure-first approach where development would not be permitted without the appropriate infrastructure being provided alongside it, those who are in favour of a limited amount of development in order to satisfy local needs, and also a range of neutral responses from statutory consultees such as Essex County Council. Most people acknowledge the need for a degree of housing. However, there are strong views about the quantity required as well as the types of housing needed. For example, more affordable housing or more appropriate housing for the elderly, for first-time buyers or for young families. It's also worth noting that Option 1 scored well, with a significant body of respondents supporting the principle of brownfield development. This option was also supported by many who supported Option 3 alongside the idea of a new community. Of the options presented in the consultation, individual respondents favoured Option 3 and its ability to deliver infrastructure required, whilst the development community, so site promoters, house builders, developers and agents, were more likely to back versions of Option 2, which was seen as a way of delivering housing and infrastructure in a shorter timescale. The next headline from the consultation was around infrastructure first. So infrastructure was one of the most common prevailing themes within the consultation. Existing communities were concerned about pressures that new development would bring to existing infrastructure, for example, roads, healthcare and education. It was strongly urged that new infrastructure was adequately planned for where required and full regard given to the capacity of existing amenities to cope with development impacts. Provision was urged to be delivered in advance of or alongside development rather than as an afterthought. This contributed significantly to the appeal of the concentrated growth option presented in spatial strategy option number 3 as this was deemed to give the scale which might provide the infrastructure required. And there was some perception in some comments that schemes in the past had not necessarily delivered what had been promised, and there was a desire to avoid this again. Next theme was around greenbelt. So the scale of promoted sites in the consultation on greenbelt land was emotive and raised concerns about overdevelopment. It raised questions about whether key aspects of the vision, for example, being the district being a green and pleasant land, were necessarily compatible with the scale of housing proposed. There was particular support for proposals within the consultation to protect the Upper Roach Valley, coastal protection belt and local green spaces, but that more should be done to protect green belt land as a whole. There was particular support for protection of agricultural land, with many noting its value in providing country with food security. And the next final headline I'd like to talk about today is around climate change and sustainability. Many comments indicated a growing awareness of climate change and concerns around its effects. An emphasis on sustainability was a common theme within responses, and there was particular concern about the district's low-lying coastal geography in many areas. This fed into concern around the scale and proposed locations of some developments, with concerns around the environmental impact, for example, loss of natural habitats, heightened risk of flooding, and risk of building in car dependency on potential new schemes, which might risk increasing air pollution. Mitigations and solutions which responses backed included more brownfield development, higher energy efficiency standards, on-site renewable power generation, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, better public transport and cycling infrastructure. Many residents felt the highest possible standards needed to be sought in development as a way of achieving net zero, although there was some challenge to this from the development industry in terms of the viability of doing so, and whether there was need to go beyond the forthcoming government future home standards. Hope that was useful and informative, and appreciate it is brief in comparison with the scope of the consultation, which did cover everything from the scope of design policies and the future of the airport through to views on how to best support high streets and local economy. We'll be happy to take any questions, or alternatively, come back in greater detail. Thank you very much.
Members, any questions? Councillor Steptoe.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I have a couple of quite big concerns with this report and agreeing to the recommendations. First of all, yes, the option of using brownfield sites first, I think, is a must. But we don't seem to have a definitive list of what brownfield sites we have. I'd like to see a definitive list of that. One of the concerns I have about brownfield sites is, does that include things like in current industrial estates, which there are one or two, and the one that springs to mind is the one in Rawrath, which technically now is in the wrong place because of the development around it. That could be considered a brownfield site, but of course that then needs to be replaced for employment. So where do we put that? The other main concern that I have is what is happening nationally. The national issues at the moment, which I'm sure everybody is fully aware of, there are figures and quotes on whether we can use greenbelt land and how greenbelt land is going to be protected and this, that and everything else is so up in the air. I don't think we fully understand what the implications of those are going to be. And therefore, I would like to suggest that we need to fully understand that before we go further with this report. They're my feelings on that particular issue.
Thank you, Councillor Steptoe. I think on the point around brownfield land, I mean, we do publish a brownfield register. We're currently working on an update to that register that should be published shortly. So there is a list of brownfield sites, and there is information on the website and elsewhere around how many, albeit we are doing an update that will obviously be more accurate than that information currently is. So I think in terms of some of the sites you indicated or referred to, I think, any site that's currently available for development, as far as we understand it, that meets the definition of brownfield, so that's sites that are in for planning or sites that have been identified in planning documents or So, for example, Roarth Industrial Estate is allocated in the allocations plan for housing. You know, it has challenges in that it's in obviously a multitude of ownerships, as we know, but all those sites make up the Brownfield Register, and obviously together that will give a capacity for brownfield land that we know about. That doesn't mean all of those sites will definitely be delivered, but you know, clearly it gives us a good idea about the capacity. So that information does exist in a format, in that register format. I think the point around the local plan and national policy, I think what I would say is that this feedback report is very much summarising a consultation that has been. So the consultation happened, and obviously this is the feedback that we got from that process. So in noting the feedback report, essentially what we're asking the committee to do is to close the door on that consultation. We're not asking necessarily the committee as part of this item to predetermine or to take anything in terms of the next steps as a matter of detail. We're asking, obviously, to note the report and to take on board what it says as we move forward to the next stage of the local plan. But when we come back with more information on the local plan, those will be their own decisions in their own right, and it will be for the committee to determine what it wants to do with that information at that stage. So we're not looking to predetermine any part of that process moving forward, but we would obviously like to be able to publish the feedback report because it closes the door on that consultation that has already been, and therefore it provides a point in time, you know, basically an account of that process, which currently doesn't exist and which we are obliged to publish under law. So in that sense, that's what the purpose of the report is, and hopefully, you know, not to kind of prejudge the next stages, so to speak.
Back, Chairman. With regards to going back to the brownfield sites in industrial areas, if we mentioned Roarth, it's an ideal one to explain. If that comes forward, how do we square the circle in supplying further employment land? Will that have to come from Green Belt and therefore creating further brownfield sites?
So thank you, Councillor Stepp. So I think in terms of what the allocations plan says, admitting that it's an 8-year-old document now, is that the land that was allocated out at Mitchell's Farm was expected in some way to compensate for that loss. So in a kind of macroeconomic sense, there has been a move in terms of land allocations to compensate for that loss. Now, what's obviously actually happened is that land hasn't been lost, and that has come forward separately. But it isn't really possible in planning to safeguard land for the occupants of an existing piece of land, so to speak. All we can really do is direct land to be replaced elsewhere. I mean, as far as the understanding that we have is that at the moment, there is not a great need for more large-scale employment land in the district, and that's because largely the needs being met, say, at Airport Business Park and at Mitchell's Farm. But that's not to say that council in the future may determine as part of the new local plan that it does want to provide new commercial employment land, and that it does want that to be, in the Rayleigh area to compensate for any potential future loss of Roarth Industrial Estate. At the moment, we can't compel the private market to bring forward Roarth Industrial Estate for housing, and so in that sense, there's no concrete certainty over whether it will or won't be lost. But at the moment, all I can really say on that is that, its loss was compensated for at a point in time, albeit compensated for in a macro sense. It's not been compensated for in the sense of people on Roarth Industrial Estate are guaranteed to get a unit somewhere else, because that's not really something planning can account for.
Briefly, we're also in the process at the moment of commissioning an economic development needs assessment. We're updating our evidence base to understand, what is the picture in the district in terms of demand for employment space, demand for different types of employment space. How have occupied demands and the nature of industry changed since the last time we did this in 2017. What types of employment space are now in demand, and what is the market doing to respond to that, and where are there gaps in the market. So we hope within a number of months to have an updated picture on that, and that will help inform the allocations picture going forward in the new local plan.
Before I take Councillor Hoy's question, I wonder if Councillor Ward, portfolio holder, perhaps would come in and comment on the latter part of Councillor Steptoe's question about the national situation.
Okay. Well, as far as I can understand with the national situation, we have to be aware that looking at recent newspaper report, as far as Castle Point is concerned, it would seem as if councils have got to get on with their local plan and get it out and get moving on it. I think it's an important factor that we all have to recognise, that it's important that we look at what is relevant as far as our planning is concerned and the evidence documents that need to be presented. But until we have that evidence in and we've looked at everything, we can't choose any preferred options at all. We have to look at all the evidence and where it points. And of course, we're going to be coming on to the transportation assessment, which is going to be very, very important, and in conjunction with Essex County Council. And I'm pleased to see we have 4 representatives from Essex County Council who will be our partners in looking at this assessment. And I think it's going to be important on them to ensure that they are partners in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Councillor Hoy, I think you were first.
Yeah, you're first, Mike.
Yep, absolutely. I do agree with Councillor Steptoe's points, and particularly on the national area. I agree with Councillor Ward as well. We have to have the evidence in place before we can move forward. But I think it's very, very important the evidence base is complete and correct as it possibly can be. This item 6 is about the consultation feedback report. What's underlying it, I can't really comment because it's about what people have said. I've got one thing I want to make clear in a minute, but the first point I want to make is that we have 141 others which haven't really been analysed at all. It's suggested that a lot of them could have been for do nothing, but I'm not sure, there's no figures there, there's nothing about what that meant. My proposal is that my motion is to send this document back to the Planning Policy Department and ask for additional analysis to be done on the other, so we are making a decision on a complete document with all the facts behind it, rather than make a decision where we don't really know what the 141 means. And I think it's important we understand what we're making decisions on, and I think that's very important. It might seem minor that it's just one line in there, but it's 141 responses. So that's my motion. I don't know if I've got a seconder for that.
I'll second that.
Second it. And just talking to that, I should have raised this before I did the motion really, but I hope Chairman gives me leeway. On page 22, we've got transport and connectivity, and we have Southend Borough Council yet again proposing that there's an opportunity for an outer strategic highway route between A130 Raleigh and Holbridge, which I obviously fundamentally oppose.
Councillor Hoy just explained page 22 of...
paper. So it's Appendix A.
Thank you.
And it's, yeah, sorry, I should have said that. And it's summary of consultation responses, table 3. And it's about 2 pages on paper into that. So it talks about improvements to the A127, but further down it's about this fabled new east-west route, or west-east route. And I just want to make sure that I am fundamentally opposed to that.
Right, there were 2 recommendations in the paper. I understand. I'm just explaining the 2 recommendations in the paper. First part was to note, and the other one was about consideration. Are you suggesting we don't note? My motion is to send it the whole thing.
Back to plan it, the whole thing back to for additional analysis work on the other 141, which is by far the majority of the responses.
If I may. So within Appendix A, paragraph 5.8, no, well, yeah.
Well, it's in
No,
there somewhere.
5.10, sorry, there is a,
remember
the
the
following paragraphs do explain what the other responses are and go into a bit of detail
Yes, it
on
does.
that.
I
Chair-
think it needs to be analysed
Sorry,
in the report.
Chair, as a point of order, we've got a motion on the table and we should be taking a vote on that. It's not for the officer to take part in that debate.
Okay. Right, we have a motion on the table, seconded. All those in favour? Against? Motion is carried 5-1 in favour. Agenda item 7, statement of community involvement. Members, Daniel Goodman will present the officer's report.
Thank you, Chairman. So this item relates to the Statement of Community Involvement 2022 update. So the Council has an adopted Statement of Community Involvement. It's a document that sets out how it will engage communities and other interested parties in the planning process. So it goes into detail around plan making, so around the local plan. It also goes into detail around planning applications and also enforcement. The Council adopted its Statement of Community Involvement in 2016, but we are obliged by law to review the document every 5 years. That review took place last year, and it found that there were a small number of issues with the current adopted version, including reference to ways in which the public can make representations, such as via fax, that are no longer possible. It also, some text was also added around how the Council would accommodate for the COVID-19 pandemic, which was obviously topical at the time because we were consulting in summer, autumn 2021 when there were restrictions in place. Those amendments are perhaps now not required. However, nevertheless, they still provide an account of that provision at that point in time. The Council also received quite a comprehensive response from Essex County Council, and that was suggesting some further minor amendments that we are suggesting are taken forward, or they're considered to add clarity rather than fundamentally change anything in the statement. So, as I said, the Statement of Community Involvement and its the amendments were subject to consultation. 12 direct responses were received. 9 of those responses were from private individuals, 1 from Essex County Council, 1 from Chelmsford City Council, and 1 from Holbridge Residents Association. I would say that some comments raised concerns or comments around the spatial options consultation, which was out at the same time. So they weren't always directly corresponding to the matters that were subject to the SCI consultation. So a feedback report has been prepared which summarises those main comments, and also appended at Appendix B, I believe, is a version of the updated SCI that we are asking the committee to recommend to Council be adopted. At that point, subject to it being adopted, that SCI, subject to those amendments, would then be the Council's adopted SCI and would fundamentally form the basis of future engagement in the planning process. Thank you.
Councillor Newport.
Chairman. Page 7.9, item 2.24. I wonder if the officers can offer some explanation as to the wording of this and why we have informal engagement with Essex County Council and other service providers in the preparation of the infrastructure funding gap assessment. Informal, to me, sounds all rather too loose. Could the officers explain that, please? Because I'm minded to seek a change on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Newport. I'd suggest that that was probably the wording suggested by the County Council, but I agree with you that fundamentally much more than informal engagement with the Essex County Council is required. So I have no objection to that being amended to formal,
Yeah.
if that is considered appropriate by the committee. I think that's reasonable.
I think we'd all say yes, please. Thank you.
The officer touched on the fact that this report was consultation was during the COVID period. On that basis, has COVID skewed the figures at all? Has there been a greater response or a less of a response because of COVID? How do officers interpret that?
So if I may, I mean, this perhaps talking to the previous item slightly as well as this one. I mean, from officers' perspective, I would say the response rate to both, particularly to the spatial options consultation was very good. There's always an issue, I think, I would always say, in terms of converting public interest into formal responses in the planning process. However, we did receive responses from over 1,500 interested people, which is, I think, a threefold increase from the previous round of consultation. Partly that's because we're starting to talk about things in more detail, so obviously it's going to get that slightly more detailed response. In terms of COVID, I think we obviously held outdoor public events. I'd say in the main they were very well attended. Some were exceptionally well attended to the point where I think it was challenging to manage, I think, in fairness. And so in that sense, I certainly don't think that COVID had particularly material impact in terms of lessening public interest. In terms of being accessible, it's always difficult if people perhaps felt less inclined to go and view the documents in public. It's always going to be challenging in that respect. However, I think the fact that we held the consultation when we did, I think it was, much better than it could have been at other times in the pandemic. And certainly we tried through, obviously, a consultation strategy that was agreed by the committee at the time. We tried our best to make sure public awareness and public engagement was as good as it could be. And the figures don't suggest to me that we struggled in that respect to get a response.
So you'd say that it was a positive effect?
I think the consultations as a whole were effective in terms of getting public responses. Whether or not COVID had much of a positive impact on that, I'm not sure. But
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Councillor Newport.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, just picking up on what Councillor Steptoe said, he raises a good point about during the pandemic. And I think that I was just trying to look through here. Did we measure the demographic of our responses to the consultation? Because I think, as we're all quite well aware, it's a lot of our older residents were hiding away, and they would be severely impacted by the digital divide. And I think that's something that we should be very mindful of. So I'd just like to know whether or not we did measure demographics on who we're responding to.
Thank you, Councillor Newport. I think in certain ways, yes, we did. We probably have a fairly good locational understanding of where the responses came from. I think what's challenging is there's no mechanism really in the process to collect people's age at the point of them making a submission. And so in that sense, it's quite difficult to understand in terms of raw numbers exactly how old those individuals were. And I don't think, and I'm saying this without knowing for sure, but I'm not sure we would have been able to come up with an effective way of capturing that information. What I would say, and I appreciate it's not as good as a data-driven understanding, is that I think we have a very good understanding from the events and from the phone calls and the correspondence and those more passive things that obviously went on during the consultation about the types of and the demographics of people who engaged. And I think what I would say is I'd say it was probably majority older people, or at least compared to younger people. So in that sense, I would say, although there probably was some kind of impact on those older people in terms of engagement, I'm not sure it materially changed the percentage that were responding in that sense.
Daniel, when you say old, are you saying over 50? Me? Am I old? I'd like... Well, no, but, I mean, it's quite generalised, your response to that. And I'd like to know how many people phoned up to, because we must do better. We must, in future consultations, we must hone the input we get from residents. Is really important. So we do need to be data-driven in where we're putting our resources as a council. It's really important that we engage with those that, that are taking part, and we know where to look. Because, at the moment, we're just going, putting it all out there, not really sure, you know, where we're going with our efforts. So I think it's something that we should really focus in on.
I think that's something we need to look at for the future, understand that. I think Daniel answered the question
Yeah.
that came to him.
That's fine, thank you.
We've got 2 recommendations on the table. The first one is to note. The second one is to to take a vote on an amended version to include the formal engagement with Essex. So on the first one, right, there are 2 recommendations on the table. One is to note and the other one is to vote upon. The second one, the vote upon one, will be adjusted slightly to recognise the formal engagement with Essex rather than the informal engagement. So the first one is to note the contents of the statement of the Community Involvement Feedback Report at Appendix A. Is this noted? All agreed? Noted. Number 2, to recommend to Council that the revised statement of community involvement at Appendix B be adopted with the amendment to include formal engagement with Essex rather than informal. All in favour? Unanimous, thank you. Agenda item 8, local plan transport assessment, high-level options paper. Daniel Goodman will present the officer's report.
Thank you, Chairman. As members will understand, so the Council is currently in the process of preparing a new local plan for the district. One of the key pieces of evidence to inform that new local plan will be a transport assessment. So clearly the purpose of a transport assessment is to understand how the highway network and how the public transport network is currently performing, to understand the impacts that development scenarios that could happen as part of the local plan will have on those networks, and therefore to identify the mitigation that might be needed to make that sustainable. So currently, the Council has prepared some initial transport evidence. This was essentially incorporated into the site appraisal paper that was presented to the Planning Policy Committee last year, and it looked at every site that had been put forward to the Council as part of the call for sites in terms of some high-level transport indicators. I think what we would suggest at this stage is that level of assessment was useful, but it's not proportionate. It's not detailed or technical enough in order to be able to inform future work on the local plan. One of the reasons for that, for example, is that proximity of a site to the highway network isn't a perfect indicator of the impact that site would have on the highway network. So there is now a need to proceed to a more technical phase of assessment. This would include a model-based assessment. So the purpose of a model clearly is to have a pre-prepared or to prepare essentially a computer program that looks at how much traffic is already on the network, look at junctions and look at wait times at junctions, and to be able to consider how the population growth that would occur as a result of building more houses or building commercial facilities would have on those traffic flows, junction waiting times, etc. And then to be able to consider what would happen if mitigation was put in place, such as, for example, a new roundabout or a new link road. So this paper has been prepared to present high-level options for delivery of that transport assessment. At the meeting of the Council's Executive on the 13th of July this year, the Executive requested that the Planning Policy Committee be asked to consider options for this transport assessment on a consultative basis. 2 main options for the progression of that work have been identified. These are, in summary, to work with Essex County Council to commission Jacobs to prepare the further phase of work. Option B, to tender for a third-party consultant to prepare the further stage of work. What I would say at this stage is that the principle of either approach is sound enough. Every other local authority in the county will have prepared a transport assessment under one of those 2 options. What I would just stress at this stage is that under either option, there is an imperative to work with the County Council as the Highway and Transportation Authority for the district. It is fundamental to the local plan being found sound that the County Council are in support of that work. That's not to say that the Council can't make representation to the County Council around their input. Doesn't mean that the council can't hold the county council to account around that work, but there is a need to work with the county council under either approach. So the report sets out some considerations under either of those two options. I will just quickly summarise those considerations, and I'm happy to expand upon them as part of questions. So in terms of cost considerations, perhaps the advantage of option A is that a model already exists that's operated by the county council as part of their contract with Jacobs. I would just stress as well that Jacobs is a separate entity to Essex Highways and Ringway Jacobs. It is part of the same company, but it is ultimately a separate entity. So the advantage of that model already existing in terms of costs means that the council would essentially be paying for the modelling as part of that model and also then the reporting. Under option B, there are guaranteed to be higher costs because what the council would have to do under that option is to go and create a new model entirely. So that would require data to be collected, to be validated, and then for that model to be put together. So testimonies from other councils, appreciating there are some commercial sensitivities around this, but we are confident in what the liaison that we've had is that extra exercise under option B would cost at least another £50,000 and take at least another 3 months. That would obviously account for that data to be collected and that model to be put together before any modelling exercise is done. As I say, perhaps the advantage under option A is that the model is already available and therefore can be used essentially fairly quickly. So I won't talk too much about timetable considerations because I think I've probably touched upon that there. The only other thing perhaps under timetable considerations that I would stress is that under either option there's going to need to be an exercise where Essex County Council review the assessment that takes place. The advantage again perhaps under option A is that because they already have a contract with Jacobs, it means that ultimately there is less need for multiple consultants having to review that work. There perhaps would be quite a lot of duplication under option B because you would have not only the modelling but also the data collection and the reporting being checked by not only the consultant preparing it but then also Essex County Council and Jacobs as part of that process. So in terms of practical considerations, as I said earlier, the council would need to work with Essex County Council under either option, and either option can deliver the work the council requires subject to some of these cost and timetable considerations. Similarly, in terms of methodology, there's no unlikely to be any material difference between these methodologies, and that's because largely the methodology is prescribed in the planning practice guidance, and there isn't much room for deviation under those options. So what we're asking the committee at this time is to, subject to obviously the discussion that we may have, is to indicate a preference for option A or B to inform a future report to the executive to take the work forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I'll be as brief as possible. I would favour option B. I'll just set out the rationale for that. I think there's firstly, I think there's deep scepticism among residents around Jacobs, about Ringway Jacobs and Essex Highways to provide good modelling. It might be good modelling, but there's a big scepticism out there, and it's not just amongst residents, among a number of councillors as well. And I think if we use option B, one, it tells residents we're listening to them. We understand that they have scepticism about the modelling produced. It might be the same modelling, but it shows that we're listening, and I think that's very important. Well, actually, I think that's the main point, really. I'll leave it there.
Chairman, can I just clarify what the officer said? When you quoted a figure for option B, was it 50 or 15,000?
So 50,000 above the other option.
50.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. If I could just comment, personally, I must admit I would go with option B. I think it needs a fresh approach to a traffic assessment within the area. Having worked with various other parties, I have a certain amount of scepticism, as has already been mentioned, with Ringway Jacobs. So, speaking personally, I would go with option B.
Any other questions? Councillor Newport?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'm going to take on board what the portfolio holder for planning has said previously, that we need to have good quality evidence. So I'm going to go with option B, because I believe that I think it's proven that the evidence that we've had previously has failed us. So I really think we've got no other alternative. So that's what I will be supporting.
Councillor Lumley? Just for the second, invite Councillor Ward, the portfolio holder, to add comment, please.
Very much indeed, Chairman. My obvious concerns will be on resource implications, and I hope that they are going to be taken on board fully by this council, that any extra needs will be granted, you know, going forward as we need them, because obviously we're going down a road that we haven't gone down before, and we're given a rough idea that it's 50 grand more, but I suspect it will possibly be more than that. I don't know. But my guess is that it possibly might be more, and our budget constraints and what they are. But if the members are happy for that to go through, I trust that they will be supporting any resource requirements that are needed in the future in regards to this local plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Newport?
Thank you, Chairman. If I may just quickly come back on what Councillor Ward said. I would, on the £50,000 possibly more, well, I think that will really come down to whether the council procures a decent contract, and that's what they need to make sure happens, so that those figures are capped, so, and the contract negotiated is not such that the costs will spiral out of control. Thank you.
I would assume that if we go down that route, it will go through proper due diligent procurement. Okay, we'll take a vote. All those in favour of option A? In favour of option B? That's 5 in favour of B, 1 in favour of A. Thank you. Agenda item 9, new local plan progress update 2022. Daniel Goodman will present the officer's report.
Thank you, Chairman. So, members, this report is a summary, I suppose, of the progress of work being undertaken on the new local plan. Some of it is admittedly more of a recap, but some of it also is providing an update. So in terms of the new local plan, as members will know, we went out to consultation last summer. That was the spatial options stage, and we presented the feedback report to that this evening. So since the conclusion of that stage, the strategic planning team have obviously considered all the comments that were received and prepared that report. And we have also progressed further work on the evidence base. So the next formal stage in the preparation of the local plan is what we're expecting to be a preferred options stage. So preferred option stage, as the name suggests, is where the council would indicate what it thinks should be done in terms of the local plan. It's not quite the submission stage where perhaps the council is saying what will be done, but it is essentially the point at which the council begins to indicate a firm preference for some options over others. So that will be at every scale, from sites and development strategies all the way down to, you know, really detailed development management policies that are considered when planning applications come in. So in terms of the timescales for that consultation, admittedly, it's probably a little bit unclear, and I think in terms of the transport assessment work, I think we'll have to take stock of that process. I'd suggest it will probably take a few weeks, if not more, to procure that assessment, and obviously then a few weeks, if not more, to get that assessment going. However, I would say that the preferred option stage at this time, we are looking probably at summer 2023 for that to allow for all that evidence to take place. But clearly the purpose of the committee and the purpose of our reports into the committee will be to give firmer updates on that. And if we can bring things forward sooner, then obviously we will do that. I think what's really important is the preferred option stage needs to be informed. Excuse me. Needs to be informed by a robust strategy and site selection process. So when the local plan is examined by the government, the council will be expected to demonstrate that its strategy is appropriate. So that relates to scale and location. So clearly that the amount of development that's being planned for is the right amount and that it's being put in the right locations. What we're expecting to do is bring forward a framework for working towards that strategy and site selection process. So it's unlikely at the next meeting we'll bring something forward that looks to set that strategy process, because clearly that's not appropriate until we have the evidence in place. However, I think what we can begin to do is talk about the general principles that should underpin that process, so that then we can start to move forward and take that evidence on board as it comes to the Planning Policy Committee. And then obviously at the end of that process, there will be a decision to be made or to be recommended around what is done. As I say, I mean, that will be into next year now, but we will do our best to obviously keep the committee informed. So I won't go back over necessarily the spatial options consultation, but clearly there are some long-term options that the council will need to think about in its new local plan. So that includes how we develop more complete communities, so how we plug gaps in infrastructure, what the role is in development in terms of plugging those holes, how best to move towards net zero and other climate change goals at the earliest opportunity. We have a little bit of a void in terms of government policy, in terms of when those kinds of targets might come in. But clearly lots of councils at this stage are looking to be as ambitious as they can be in that regard, and move forward to net zero standards as early as possible. So prioritising brownfield contaminated land in site selection as a preference over greenfield sites. I think that we've spoken about that many times. But also protecting the district's agricultural heritage, moving towards local self-sufficiency. So something that Dan Kudler mentioned in item, I'm going to say 6, was around looking a resident priority around safeguarding agriculture for the future. So in terms of the evidence base, a lot of evidence has been completed. Much of that has come to this committee over many years to be noted. And obviously that evidence base will continue to be noted, or will continue to be presented to this committee. Most pertinently, we are refreshing our needs evidence. So that's the evidence that looks at perhaps how much development we might require. So there are updates ongoing around housing needs. I would just stress that's not to do with necessarily how much housing overall is required. It's more to do with how much affordable housing, housing for older people, housing for people with disabilities is required. Obviously, the national, as we've touched upon, the overall housing figure is set nationally, and we're not quite sure how that might change at this stage, but the consultants working on that assessment are very cognizant of what that movement looks like, and they're highly prepared and likely to have to prepare, obviously, addendums to that report in the future if things do change. So we're also looking at economic development needs assessment updates, retail needs assessment updates, and gypsy and traveller accommodation assessment updates. So those studies have all been done in the past, but we are looking to prepare newer updates that look at our needs over a longer period, given many of those reports are now 4 or 5 years old, and obviously certain things have changed. So those assessments are well advanced, so we're looking to have them hopefully finished by the end of next month, and then they will come to the Planning Policy Committee to be considered. And I suppose at that stage they will form a bit of a package, I suppose, of needs assessments that will interrelate to one another. In terms of other evidence, obviously we have spoken about the transport assessment. The other really important evidence that we're working on at the moment is a viability assessment for the local plan. So that essentially will look at the overall cost implications for the policies in the local plan and make sure that ultimately the strategy is viable, because that will be one of the key tests at examination, is that although we might want to, that we're not creating cost implications on sites that are such that it means that actually they aren't capable of coming forward. And so there is obviously a balance to be struck about pushing infrastructure and development as far as we can without it being able to be challenged at examination for being unviable, and then potentially pressure on us to loosen our policies. An infrastructure delivery plan, ultimately that goes hand in hand with the local plan, and that will look at the infrastructure that's needed to make the local plan and its development sites sustainable. So it will cost that infrastructure and set out when it's expected to be delivered and by who. That will also support kind of funding bids if there's any funding gap. And also a level 2 strategic flood risk assessment that will look at the flood risks of specific sites that could be identified for development. So all that evidence is going to be procured soon, but we are obviously going to have to take account of the local plan timetable to make sure that actually that lines up from perspective, because a lot of that does depend on knowing the direction of travel, shall we say, for the preferred option for that to be tested, essentially. So the strategic planning team are continuing to support the preparation of a non-statutory planning framework for South Essex. So this has evolved over time. Originally, it was expected to be a statutory plan, but it is now more of a framework. So this may set overarching principles for how the sub-region would grow and develop and address key cross-boundary issues. However, I think importantly, it will not replace local plans, and it will not, shall we say, slow or otherwise bind those local plans in terms of its content, but it is being developed with kind of added value in mind, drawing the lines between individual local plans so that case for added value can be made. In terms of wider work streams, we've spoken about the statement of community involvement today. The annual monitoring report for last monitoring period, I'm aware that it says 2022-2023. I will correct that to say it's 2021 to 2022. That's being prepared currently, and I expect that will be finished in the next 2 weeks. Similarly, a Brownfield register is in the process of being updated, and I expect, again, that will be finished in the next week or so. Traditionally, those reports have gone out as portfolio holder decisions, and I expect that will be how we look to issue them again, but I'm more than happy to discuss those items if members are interested. So that's a summary of the update. I appreciate there's a little bit of uncertainty in there, but I think, as we've mentioned at previous committees, what we'd like to do is continue to provide those updates as a little bit of a standing item, and then we can try our best to keep members informed of progress on different matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Councillor Ward, you wanted to say something, please, first.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Together with this, bearing in mind that we want this update on the Brownfield register, which is really, really important, I think it's important, again, looking back on what has gone previously in this meeting, to make sure that items 5 and 6, I know we're doing the Brownfield report and everything else, they come back to Council as soon as possible, come back to this committee, so that we can look at the various amendments that have been asked and the questions answered in regards to members' needs, and so they can be satisfied the whole way through. I think that's important, you know, that we crack on and get that on the go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Councillor Steptoe.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. One or two questions and clarifications, if I may, Chairman. With regards to item 3.12 on page 9.4, the Gypsy and Travellers accommodation, there is, under the current plan, a site that was set aside at Michelin's Farm, which I think is unlikely to be coming forward. Is there any mileage in regularising the site up in Rawreth, which is currently technically under an enforcement action? And does the assessment take into account the odd sites that are dotted around the district, sort of pepper potted across the district? That's my first question. Second point I wanted to raise, I don't see anywhere in the report with regards to duty to cooperate. Where are we with that situation? And Councillor Ward touched on the Brownfield register. I assume officers will be sending a copy out of that to members here and the council in general as soon as that is available, because it does say here August, September. You're on a tight deadline now.
I think Mr Goodman's made clear the brownfield register will be distributed.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Steptoe. I think with regards to that Gypsy Travel Accommodation Assessment, what I would say firstly is that's an assessment of demand, I suppose, for Gypsy Traveller sites. And the way that demand is generated is from pitches that already exist that have not got planning permission. And that's, you know, small sites with one pitch on all the way up to, you know, the site on the A1245. So those make up the bulk of that unmet need. And obviously every time a pitch gets planning permission, you know, that comes off of that need, if you like, because that need's then met. There are also other assumptions in there around children growing up and requiring their own pitch, etc. So that the assessment is very much a kind of comprehensive picture of the need for pitches. What it won't address is the supply of those pitches, other than to say this is what has planning permission and therefore this is what does not generate a new need. I think in terms of decisions to regularise other sites, I think that's probably not actually planning policy in a sense. I think that's probably more, you know, a council decision, and that would come via development management, really. The only way that would probably come via the local plan is obviously if we said in the local plan, which we could, that our policy is that those sites could achieve planning permission, and therefore we allow for that in the policy. I think at this time, if you know, those households are entitled to make a planning application if they want to, but that would be for development committee to decide. And I don't think probably there's anything in the Gypsy Travel Accommodation Assessment that would address the suitability of those sites outside of a planning application process. So I think there are probably slightly different processes as part of this. But if we still have an unmet need issue in a year, 2 years' time that the local plan can address, then obviously, you know, there will be options for doing that. I just think on a short-term basis, it's probably more of a development management process than a planning policy process. Oh, yes, sorry. So, yes, so, I mean, the feedback report for the spatial options consultation set out the kind of the responses from duty to cooperate partners. And I think, you know, in terms of an update, I mean, there isn't particularly an update, because other than to say, I suppose, with respect to Castle Point Council and Basildon Councils, both councils have made decisions to pause work on their local plans. And so in those sense, that relationship is slightly different now, because clearly those local plans that they had that we agreed statement of common grounds with no longer exist in a sense. So in that sense, that relationship needs to kind of be changed. But until they start preparing work on their local plans, that work hasn't really commenced. In terms of with Southend Council, I mean, they, as I understand it, are working on their local plan. They're looking at their strategy options, as are we. We identified in the spatial options consultation, obviously, that strategy that had a bit of synergy, but there's no, you know, nothing advanced in terms of, you know, that discussion, or nothing advanced in terms of the strategy and site selection process. And obviously, as I think, as I've set out in the report, that remains within our local plan's gift to resolve. So in that sense, there probably isn't an update, and that's why I've omitted to give one, really. The only exception to that I will take this opportunity to say is that we have had a formal request from Essex County Council to agree a statement of common ground with them at this stage. So, you know, I expect we will present the draft wording of that to be agreed in due course. So that is perhaps the exception. But on the other relationships, I'd say there's probably not a concrete update to give, I'm afraid.
Council come to this committee?
Historically, it probably wouldn't come to this committee. It would go out as a portfolio holder decision, I would suggest. But I have no problem with, you know, it being shared once kind of in that domain. I have no problem with. But historically, we would do it via the portfolio holder decision route, because it tends to be bigger than the local plan. It tends to be kind of slightly, more strategic planning than the local plan core. But I mean, I'm happy to discuss that.
Yeah, I personally prefer it to come to this committee, so we could discuss it. I think that would be a good option.
Chairman, with regards to Councillor Steptoe's suggestion, it's something we would need to look at. It might just be a portfolio holder decision, but Mr Goodman probably could bring it back as an update for some observations by committee members.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ward.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just to remind members that we do have a site which is in Michelin's, and we are currently looking at CPO on that site. So this is something we are currently looking at and investigating whether we can go forward with that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Newport, you had a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'd like to pick up on the Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment. It's one of my favourite subjects because it's been ongoing for, well, as long as I can remember. And I just want to pick up on a point that Councillor Steptoe made about whether all those temporary sites that the council keeps granting are, whose decision would it be whether they were legalised or become our policy? Is that not a planning policy decision, or is that, where would that fall to? And where is this definitive list of all these different sites? Because I can't get my hands on it for love nor money. And I think it's important that we actually know what we're dealing with. And I think that needs to come to the committee as part of this evidence that we're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newport. I think in terms of the components of need and the demand, I mean, I suppose what I would say is that in terms of how the local plan might address it, and therefore how it might come to Planning Policy Committee, is clearly if we have an unmet need, for example, when we're looking at the preferred option stage. So we will report the GTAA update into this committee first and foremost, but if we have an unmet need at that stage, then obviously the options that might be before the committee are to include something in the local plan around a policy that I suppose makes it easier for those existing sites to become regularised, or it might be to identify new land for a Gypsy and Traveller site, or it might be to do something else. I suppose in the short term, I suppose there's not much that the local plan can do to regularise those sites, because what they need to be regularised is planning permission, really. So what those landowners could do is obviously choose to make a planning application, and then it's up for Development Committee to decide if they want to grant it or not. So there's nothing, really that I can think of as part of this process that would provide an accelerated solution for that. In theory, anybody can make planning application for anything, but I suppose the difficulty that those sites clearly have is the balance between, typically Greenbelt and the need. And so I wouldn't want to kind of prejudge any decision Development Committee might choose to make or not make in the future. But I think it is the timing issue. I think there's something can be done in the local plan to address the issue, but it's if there's a desire by council or whomever to do something sooner, then I think that probably is, like I say, a matter that would require planning applications ultimately. And that's kind of I think probably outside the local plan's influence to kind of bring those planning applications to reality.
Members, there's one recommendation at paragraph 9.1 on page 9.7 of the report, which is to note the local plan progress update August 2022 as set out in this report. Members, is this noted? Thank you. Meeting closed at 9:08. Thank you.